Welcome to the Conscious Community Podcast. I'm your host, Janae.
And I'm Spencer.
This episode, we speak with Rabbi Rami Shapiro about his book, Holy Rascals and the One River Foundation. Rabbi Rami is a columnist, the host of the Essential Conversations podcast, and the author of over 30 books. Hello, Rami. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
I felt a lot of commonality with you reading your book. You talk about holy rascals not being subservient to the dogma of brand name religions. They find the perennial wisdom in all religions, and another characteristic is their use of humor to transcend across and find that universal truth. I've always been nervous as being taken as a comedian because so many artists, musicians, and comedians who really do have a message kind of get shunted off under the category of entertainment. You have somebody like George Carlin or Bill Hicks who's dropping this really heavy truth on the audience, but at the end of the day, people can just laugh it off and say that's just entertainment. Do you think that's a problem for Holy Rascals?
Well, I think both, that it's a problem and also a gift in a sense. I mean, the problem is something like you said, where people say, well, that's just entertainment. I think a bigger problem is when people think that laughing is in and of itself enough. You know, like when you watch late night television and they make fun of the political situation in the United States and we laugh at it, or we're sarcastic, or we find the irony in it, and we think, oh, that's resistance. Now I've done it. I can go back and just live my life and ignore what's going on because I've made fun of it or whatever. I think that you can convince yourself that merely making fun or merely having fun is sufficient. That isn't what the Holy Rascal is trying to do. The Holy Rascal uses humor in order to strip away the BS that so many religions hide behind. And that I don't think is a problem in the sense of, oh, it's just entertainment. Because it's got such a sharp edge to it that it carries enough gravitas to actually make a difference. So you're not simply laughing at something, you're actually using laughter as a way of freeing yourself from that something. In that moment of laughter, there is a kind of revelation, a kind of truth can come through. And that's why you talk about fools for Christ, and that's why you have the crazy wisdom traditions in Buddhism and Hinduism and Islam. Laughter is this freeing thing. My Zen master, Joshu Suzaki Roshi, told me back in the 70s that, I mean, he was a real traditional Japanese Zen master, but he said, Zazen's fine, Zen meditation is fine, but if you don't really need it. All you need to do is sit on the edge of your bed when you wake up in the morning and start to laugh. And he said, at first it'll be forced laughter, but after a while, the laughter becomes real. And when the laughter becomes real and you let it take over and you end up with tears rolling down your cheeks, then you can stop, get up and go about your day, and you'll be living your life in a state of, he didn't say grace, but I would say a state of grace, a state of liberation. Because when we laugh, it's at the heart of so much conventional or brand name religion is fear. And when you're laughing, fear can't take hold. So laughter is, in a sense, the great liberator, though I get your point about it could be mere entertainment.
I've often thought that one thing in the category of perennial wisdom is that reality is a joke and God is a comedy writer. It's just an idea that's occurred to me many times, especially when looking at the news in the last year or so. It's just so absurd it almost has to be kind of a joke. I felt some of the times I've been most terrified, I have used humor as a coping mechanism. Maybe one of the reasons why we laugh at things on the news when we watch The Late Show is to serve as that coping mechanism. We're scared, so we make a joke out of it. I did a lot of research on post-traumatic stress, and when they first started noticing these cases in World War I, they were calling it shell shock. Their research at the time showed that the Australians were the most resistant to it, and they attributed that to their graveyard humor.
Yeah, I can understand that. I want to make a distinction between laughter as a coping mechanism and laughter as a liberating mechanism, in the sense that, Jews, laughter is such a powerful coping mechanism in our tradition. So I absolutely get that and can agree with that. But I think there's something else that we're talking about here rather than coping. I think, and that's this liberating factor. You can use laughter in war to cope with the horror of it. But if the laughter were deeper, people wouldn't go to war. When the world that we have to cope with is a world that we created by taking everything too seriously, by allowing ourselves to be manipulated by fears that are invented. I mean, there are real things to be afraid of. I mean, climate change or global warming is one of them. But the stuff that we get all animated about, and the stuff that we actually go to war over, isn't how to fix the climate. It's how to screw somebody else. And when you use laughter the way the Holy Rascal tries to use laughter, there is nobody else. It's not us against them. It's just all of us together. So, and that's crucial, I think, to the whole notion of perennial wisdom. The Holy Rascal isn't simply an entertainer. I mean, a Holy Rascal does entertain, otherwise no one's going to listen. But the Holy Rascal isn't merely an entertainer. The Holy Rascal is promoting, at least in my understanding of it and what I'm pushing in this book, the perennial wisdom. And perennial wisdom stands for something. To put it as simply as possible, there's 4 points to perennial wisdom. I mean, number one is that all existence is the manifesting of a singular reality. I mean, perennial wisdom is radically non-dualistic. You can call the reality God or Tao or nature or mother or whatever name people give to it. But there's just this one thing, that's in quotes, that manifests as each of us. So the diversity arises out of a non-duality. When you realize that, you get to point two. And that point two is that there's a universal ethic of justice and love, respect, dignity that arises out of that realization. When I know that you and I are unique manifestings of this singular reality, I can't harm you. I just, we're of the same body in a sense. And it makes no sense to see you as an alien or as an other or as a threat. The third point of the 4 in perennial wisdom is that you can do this. You don't need a religion to help you do it. You can awake to the one of which we're all a part and to the universal ethic of justice and compassion that arises from it. And then the fourth is, this is the highest calling that humans can imagine. Awakening to our truest nature. I'll use God language because it's poetic in this sense. Awakening to yourself and all others as God and acting godly is the highest thing we can be called to do. Religions are not about that. And that's the distinction that I'm trying to make in this book and in other books I've written. That religion is not about this universal love and justice. Religion breaks people up into, depends on the religion, the language, the chosen and the not chosen, the saved and the damned, the true believer and the infidel, the twice born and the not twice born in Hinduism, the different castes in Hinduism. Anyway, my point is that organized religion breaks people up and sets people apart, and then oftentimes uses that false sense of alienation to fuel violence against the other, however that other is defined. Perennial wisdom doesn't do that. The Holy Rascal is trying to free religion from its parochial mask, I guess you might say, and reveal the perennial that's at the heart of all of that.
What about the movement for people to embrace various traditions from around the world? They're leaning towards perennial wisdom, but some people seem to look at it as a way to acquire new dogma, new rituals. What do you say to point those type of people towards the truth behind the rituals?
Yeah, that's always the challenge, is the struggle between literalism and metaphor, or the lyrical or the poetic. We tend to take these things very shallowly, which is another way of saying very literally. So when people of different religious backgrounds come together and tap the perennial in their own tradition and share that among one another, I think that's fabulous. I mean, in 1984, Father Thomas Keating then retired to Snowmass, St. Benedict's Monastery in Snowmass, Colorado, convened what ended up to being a 35-year experiment in bringing contemplatives together from different religions. And we would live together for a week, a little bit longer, and practice in our own way, but discuss the experiences we were having in our practices and the realities or the insights we got from the practice. And we discovered that while Buddhists are not practicing the same way Jews are, when we're doing our contemplative practices, not the conventional rituals, but the meditation practices within different traditions, when you're doing your meditative work, your contemplative work, you seem to come to the perennial. And we found that, I was there from the beginning, we found that in the very first gathering, that it didn't matter what tradition you were coming from, where you ended up as a contemplative practitioner was with the perennial. So when people get together and say, here's something that works for me as a Catholic, or here's something that works for me as a Hindu, as I'm sharing the deeper level of perennial wisdom, I might borrow that. I don't have a problem with that. But if I then have to become a Catholic to use it or a Hindu to use it, then I'm stuck. So we have to look at these things the way the Zen people talk about them, as fingers pointing toward the moon and not the moon itself. And in the world of the Holy Rascal, we're happy to follow the finger of anyone who's pointing toward that perennial truth. In the world of brand name religions, usually people take their fingers and simply, give each other their finger, as it were.
People take the metaphorical level of things so literally. Many people don't seem to be capable of the kind of metacognitive processes of self-examination. They want to do the right thing as they were taught when they were young, and maybe at a certain age they picked up a different right thing to do. They get very fixated on the ritual and the dogma and all the trappings. I've seen, like in youth culture today, this kind of new hippie movement, and rather than looking for that perennial wisdom, they're kind of stacking dogmas on top of each other. So they're doing mantras and they're meditating and they're wearing beads and they're doing yoga, but the only thing that they seem to be missing is that central truth that ties it all together.
Like in the book, when you talked about the life stages, does that kind of correspond to where you talked about the second part of the first life?
Yeah, I think that's true of me. The format is, life one and life two, and life one has two stages, the material and the spiritual, and life two. That's okay, Janae. You have a terrible cold. Yeah. So, life one, material phase, life one, spiritual phase, and then life two is when you really just rest in the reality of the divine, if you don't mind that kind of language. Life one, phase one is when and it's not a bad thing. I mean, it's a certain stage in life when you have to go out and you have to, if you have rent or mortgage and you have I hate the phrase, but you have to earn a living, which seems like such a terrible idea, that you have to earn your living. All of that is normal, and you end up with all kinds of stuff and all kinds of debt. And at some point, you ask yourself the question, and this is universal, or I don't mean universal, everyone does this, but every tradition has some version of this, that you simply ask yourself the question, is this all there is? And then you have the option of slipping back into life one, phase one, and get a better car or a better spouse or a better job. Or you slip into life one, phase two, where you start the pursuit of the spiritual. But you do it with the same mindset, the same material mindset that you did life one, phase one. So you collect retreats the way you used to collect Fabergé eggs, to give a silly example. You get the best yoga clothes, the best yoga mats. You go out and hunt of the ultimate spiritual book, and there's never an end to them. So you keep buying more and more books and buying more and more CDs and, taking on the trappings, like you said, of more and more religious traditions. It's normal. It's a stage that we all go through, and maybe these stages overlap. So, I'm sitting here in a library, my private library, and there's tons of books that I've collected over the years because I'm searching for insights. I think I know the truth because I believe that the perennial wisdom is true. I know that I and you and everything else are manifestings of the divine singular reality, that non-dual reality. But I have all these books that are trying to tell me the same thing, and it's just a phase you go through. Then, though, at some point, you realize that I'm getting carpal tunnel from all the mudras that I'm doing, and my neck is sore from all the beads that I'm carrying around, and it's just not working for me anymore. I'm just masking the fact that I still don't know what the hell I'm talking about, and that's when you can slip into life two. And in life two, there's just awareness. There's just you just know, and at that point, though, you don't have to give up the mantra. You don't have to give up a religion. You just now are playing with it, as opposed to taking it so literally and so seriously. Religion should be seen as play. It's theater. Ritual is theater. It gives us great music and great art and great architecture and all this stuff, but only when you play with it. And that's a phase, that's life too. That's a phase that few of us actually get into because it's so frightening. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'll be sent to hell for this kind of thing. But when you really work through life one, phase two, and slip into life two, because it's not a matter of choosing, it's a matter of grace. It just happens. But when you're in life two, you realize, no, this is not. I was doing what I had to do at that stage in my life, but I'm not afraid anymore. And now I chant. I mean, I personally chant in Sanskrit and in Hebrew and English, in Japanese. I mean, I have a variety of mantra that I do on a daily basis. And I love meditation. I know different types, but I basically just do a basic, sitting meditation. I love chanting. I love mantra work. I mean, all this stuff, it's the way I play with the spirit. But I think, there may be lots of people still caught, or there are lots of people, and myself included in some ways, still caught with this. There's something out there that I don't have, and I've got to get it, and I'm going to buy it or somehow latch onto it. And that's a necessary stage that we have to go through.
The thing you touched on there, for example, is some people would say, oh, religion, it's destructive, we should get rid of it. But we need to acknowledge that we wouldn't have Bach, we wouldn't have Michelangelo if there hadn't been religion. We need to see it as inspirational.
I was listening to Sam Harris recently, and he was debating a Jewish scholar. Sam was making the argument that morality can exist in an atheist environment, and the scholar said, well, you wouldn't be able to conceive of the idea of being a good person if it hadn't been for religion. And I think that in that evolution of consciousness of man, there have been some struggles and clashes, but we wouldn't have gotten to where we are without religion.
Yeah, let me jump in on that, Spencer. It's really interesting and very important, I think. I mean, first of all, they're both right and they're both wrong in a sense. You can certainly create the difference is religion bases on, is the way they're talking about it, is based on revelation, and the other is based on reason. So you can create a rational ethic. I don't think that's impossible to do. The question is, can you create an ethic that is universal, that is unquestionable? And, the religion people say, of course, it comes from revelation. Reason, if you're reasoning, people reason different ways. But the fact is, whether it's from reason or revelation, no ethical system protects you from the human capacity for evil. So you can say, as a religion person, my religion says that you should love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, fine. Then look to see what the religion does with that teaching. So you manage to simply define neighbor in such a limiting way that it allows you to do whatever the hell you want to people who are no longer defined as your neighbor. So there is no guarantee that your God is a source of morality. When, in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, there's a line where I think it's Ivan says, without God, all is permitted. And the idea is that if you don't have God telling you what's right and wrong, people will do whatever they want. But the fact is, with or without God, people do whatever they want. So you have, right now, you have Buddhists in Myanmar going after, raping, murdering the Rohingya just because they're different. They're not the neighbor. They're not Buddhists. They're Muslims. You have the same thing going on between Islam and Jews and Muslims and Jews and Christians and Muslims and Christians and Jews and Buddhists, and everyone is doing it. right? Hindus and Muslims in India, everyone manages to take their religion, twist it in such a way that allows them to do whatever the hell they want to people who are not considered part of their, religious circle. So with or without religion, people are intrinsically violent, not exclusively violent, but it's part of our nature. So religion doesn't keep you safe from that, and neither does reason. I mean, you can look at societies that had no religion, Stalinist, Soviet Union under Stalin. There wasn't a religious motivation for the horror that he inflicted upon people. So you don't need religion to be bad in order to commit horror, but religion doesn't save you from committing horror either. There's nothing that saves you other than, I would say, the realization that we are all part of the same reality. And and this may be Pollyanna-ish of me, but when you do realize the non-duality of things, an ethic of compassion and justice arises naturally in and of itself. But that's a hard realization to attain.
In that thought, do you think there is a time when branded religions will disappear? Or will they continue to exist as a connection to our human ancestors?
I think that, the religions, you can pick any religion you want, but the religion as it exists in the 21st century is not the way it existed in the 1st century or the 3rd century or, BC, before the Common Era period. Religions evolve. So I don't think we're going to end up with a world that has no Christianity or Hinduism or Islam in it. But I think that the way those religions, and I could pick any religion, but the way those religions are define themselves will change. And hopefully they change in a more universalistic way. And part of that change would mean they should all watch, every religious leader and every religious tradition ought to watch the Bill Moyers interview with Joseph Campbell, The Power of Myth, and realize that religion is talking not literally, but metaphorically. And that while each religion has its own myths, and I don't want to have them all smushed into one another into some monomyth, I don't want to lose their distinction, but I want to realize that they're all variations on a common theme. And then we can share the variations, and you can end up with, I'm mixing my metaphors here, but you can end up with what Paul Simon did back when he produced the Graceland album, for example, where he blended South African music with, American pop. And he ended up with this new fusion of things, because in music you can do that. And so I would suggest that we reach a level of religious awareness where we understand that we're playing in a metaphoric, we're playing with metaphor, and we can begin to have a fusion, but not all religions coming together into one thing, but playing with one another and seeing the commonalities that they share and the truths, I would say, that these myths contain, or the truths these myths point toward. And then the truth rather than the myth becomes the focal point. But I agree that I wouldn't want religion. Well, I don't think religion itself can disappear. I think it's hardwired into us. But I don't want to see the disappearance of any specific religion, or I don't imagine the disappearance of all of the specific religions. But I do imagine their evolution. And there will be new religious traditions. I mean, you have something like Baha'i, which is, relatively speaking, new in the world of religion, and that was an evolution. Now, they may not say this, obviously, but I would suggest it's an evolutionary stage in human religiosity coming out of Persia. Unitarian Universalism, you might see something similar. Say something similar, especially about contemporary Unitarian Universalism. It's a evolution, maybe originally within Christianity. Maybe now they would say they're post-Christian, but religions do evolve, and they devolve. But hopefully, if we're looking at the future, we see the future of religion evolving toward the perennial.
I think that's a good point. I think that it's interesting how it seems to be that various religions all seem to get one of the parts of the perennial wisdom that the other ones don't get. And if you look, you can find those little pieces and put them together. Like how Judaism has a sense of justice, or Buddhism, the contemplative, or Christianity, mercy and grace. Those all come from different traditions, but when you put them together, you really get to the heart of the perennial wisdom.
Yeah, the way I look at religion in general is the way I look at language. So, language is a human creation. It reflects and feeds back into the culture out of which it comes. No language is true or false. But some languages are better at some things than others. There are some things you can say in one language that you can't say or can't say as effectively in another language. So the goal with language is to be as multilingual as possible. The more languages that we know, the more nuanced our understanding of life becomes. I apply the same thinking to religion, that there's things you can say in Buddhism that you can't say or can't say as well in Judaism, perhaps. There are things that the whole notion of Christ and the crucifixion and the meaning of crucifixion and resurrection and all of that. That is such a strong Christian trope. You're not going to find it as strong in any other tradition. So what I want to do is I want to be multilingual within the context of religion. Learn the trope, learn the myth, learn the stories, learn the insights of the various religions. And the more I know, the more nuanced my understanding of life becomes. My mother tongue is Judaism. I'm a Jew. I'm a rabbi. I make no bones about that. I have no problem with that. But to really be a nuanced spiritual person, I have to know more. I can't be monolingual. I have to know more than one language, and I try to learn as many as possible. And then all of that said, with the ultimate caveat that in the end, the ultimate language of awakening is silence.
You say that your mother tongue is Judaism. Is that because of how you were raised? Have you made a conscious decision to remain a rabbi and to remain being Jewish, even though you learned all this other wisdom from these other traditions?
I was raised Jewish in an Orthodox Jewish environment. But when I was 16, I discovered Buddhism through class in high school, and Hinduism. But Buddhism spoke to me at that point. And I became what I would have called then a serious Buddhist practitioner. I had a Zen teacher and ultimately worked with several Zen masters. And I took it very seriously as a practice, not simply as book learning, but as a practice. And I was sitting zazen and going on retreats and doing all this stuff. And later in my life, Hinduism spoke to me, and Taoism always spoke to me. And after '84, when I began to work with Father Thomas Keating and Catholic thought and Christian thought in general, with people like Cynthia Bourgeot, I find wisdom in all these places. And there was a moment when I said, well, I'm really a terrible Jew because, when I'm talking about these things, I'm blending the languages of Hinduism and Buddhism and Judaism and Taoism and Christianity and Islam. And, I have gone to India many times to teach, and several times to teach. And oftentimes when I'm there and I'm talking about Judaism, Swamis will come up and say, that sounds like Vedanta Hinduism. And, are you sure you're telling us Judaism? And what the confusion is, and this is how I sort of reconciled it for myself, is the Judaism I teach is the perennial wisdom that comes through Judaism. I'm using Jewish language, Jewish tradition, symbol, ritual to expound the perennial. And that's why if you're a Hindu who's also rooted in the perennial, you're going to hear a lot of resonances with that. Because the perennial is, my Rebbe, Almen Shalomi, said, talking about himself, but me as well, that he was a Jewish practitioner of perennial wisdom. And that's what I am. I'm a Jewish practitioner of perennial wisdom. The first book I go to is the Bible. The first language I go to is Hebrew. The first symbol system I go to is that associated with Judaism. And probably for no other reason than, it wasn't just bedtime stories. I was steeped in it without any alternative for the first 16 years of my life. So it probably is that. If I was raised a Taoist, a philosophical Taoist, not a religious Taoist, But if I was raised in the philosophy of Lao Tzu and Chuangzi, I would, feel very blessed because then I didn't have to unlearn a lot of nonsense. I think those guys were really brilliant and without a lot of baggage. But I wasn't. So, I make peace with what I've got, but it's when you're rooted in the perennial, you can really open yourself up to all of these and not feel entrapped by any of them. And the notion of conflict that you're not being, I forgot how you put it, I'm sorry, but not being genuine. I mean, who's going to decide that? You buy into someone else's definition of this is what a genuine Jew is. And then I'm not that. But why empower that person to define Judaism for me or any other tradition? Why empower that person to tell me I'm genuine or not genuine? So when it's the perennial that is our focus, and we realize as a holy rascal that we're really talking about religion as play at its best, then all of those serious kinds of who's in and who's out questions about genuineness, I think just fall away.
In your book, you said being a holy rascal is a high calling. I feel like we're at this convergent point in history. One of the examples that I use is that I listen to many different podcasts, and they're all on different subjects, but all of them are talking about the nature of consciousness lately. Everything from science and business and spirituality are all running towards some kind of center point. In the book, you talked about how holy rascals are playing this key role in this process, and you asked the question, well, how do you avoid being crucified? And answered yourself that you can't. That really disturbs me because I feel like we're in a make it or break it period for humanity. And I'd say that ever since the invention of thermonuclear weapons, we've been running down the clock as to whether or not we can evolve as a species before we blow ourselves up. And I think that if you look at the Christ mythology, my takeaway from that is he sacrificed himself for a message, and for 2,000 years, we didn't do a very good job of taking his point. What I'm saying is that the work of the holy rascals have to do is very critical for the survival of the species, and I don't feel like we can afford to sacrifice them any longer and punt another 2,000 years or 50 years or maybe even 20 years.
I think the point, though, with that mythology is even if the messenger dies, that the message will keep coming back.
Yeah. We may be at what we might call the big button moment, given Kim Jong-un and Donald J. Trump. Yeah. I understand what you're saying. When I'm talking about with crucifixion notion is that you have to be willing to. Jesus says, "Take up your cross and follow me." I was a university professor. I taught Bible for 10 years, and I would ask my students, what we would read that passage. I taught both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. I would get to that passage, and I would say, "Okay, so what does that mean? What's your cross?" And they would all have these things like, I come from a broken home, or I was an addict, or I am, no one admits to being an addict. I'm a recovering alcoholic, or I use drugs, or, whatever it is, whatever the thing is. And I would try to explain to them that nobody was crucified in Roman-occupied Jewish Palestine 2,000 years ago because they had a tough childhood or because they drank too much. They were crucified because they went up against the powers that be. And that's what we have to do. That's what holy rascals are doing. They're doing it in a fun way, I hope. Our job is to call out that the emperor has no clothes. And that can get you in trouble. And I think that, whoever the emperor is at the moment, that's the person who's trying to crucify you. The resurrection, because the crucifixion is not the end of Christianity. It's just, the resurrection is the core. And I think that's what Janae was saying, that the idea lives on, that you could stop any one holy rascal, but I don't think you can stop holy rascality. The notion, though, that we are, at this horrific, or at least potentially horrific, into this horrific end times. So many religions talk about that. And I wonder if it isn't in fact true in some sense that we are in what the Hindus call the Kali Yuga, and that this is a natural endpoint for a certain kind of mentality, and it has to die. Now, my hope is that the mentality we're talking about is the mentality of the zero-sum, us against them, fixed pie winners and losers world. And all religions that focus on that. All the religions that are clinging to notions of saved and damned and chosen and not chosen, they either have to die themselves, which I don't think will happen, or they have to allow those ideas to be radically reinterpreted, or let those ideas fade away. And that's probably more practical. But we're in this time where, as you said, with the sort of coming together of science and spirituality, we're in this time when these zero-sum philosophies are leading us toward a non-metaphorical dead end. I mean, the planet, perhaps, and certainly our species, is in big trouble. So can we make a turn at this point? Can this be another axial age where the consciousness of humanity evolves to the point where we put the buttons away and we put away this whole zero-sum kind of thinking? I mean, that you don't know. I mean, we'd have to see. We have to wait a few hundred years to find out and see if there's anyone left to find out. But it's a real thing. It's a real problem. The question that comes up for me at this kind of juncture is, are we going to give ourselves over to a different kind of nonsense, or are we going to cut through to a deeper understanding of truth? And I think you see both going on, that people are grasping for things that I consider nonsensical, both in the conventional religion world, but in the conventional New Age world. Just a lot of stuff that's going to be saving us, but none of it really does. And it's just, and it all comes down to sort of capitalist spirituality, where people are just selling us all kinds of BS, not just ideas, but product, all kinds of gimmicks, all kinds of products that are supposed to save us when nothing really does. You know, is it a life one, phase two kind of collapse, or which as an endpoint, or can we just break through that into life two, where we just move beyond the non-zero, beyond the zero-sum world? I don't know if I'm making any sense, but I want to reinforce that the notion that yeah, this is a crucial time. It's and there's no guarantee which way we go, but holy rascals have to be hopeful. Otherwise, I mean, if you don't have hope, you don't have humor, I guess.
I kind of view this as a tightrope that we're walking, like a ridge line on a mountain that just keeps getting narrower and narrower. If we can bridge that gap to where we come out on the other side and the threat of nuclear war or climate change or environmental collapse or ecosystem collapse can be averted, then we should be okay to go on to the galaxy. My joke is always, we're going to do some Star Trek stuff on the other side of this if we can make it through. If anyone is going to work it out, it's going to be the holy rascals that come from each of these different religions, because they can communicate with each other where the rank and file of their tribe or religion cannot. They in turn are often respected by their own tribe, even if they're hated by other tribes. It's almost kind of a metaphysical diplomacy where you've got these scholars or religious experts from different traditions, and they're talking amongst each other and then taking it back to their people, and they're building a kind of consensus. I feel like consensus is really important if you're going to have some kind of universal ethos. You can't have one big happy world if you're imposing a consensus that deeply morally wounds some of those parties. I kind of see the holy rascals as the diplomats of the spiritual world, and probably more likely to bring those tribes together than the official leaders of those tribes.
Oh yeah, I agree. I'm hopeful for that as well. If you don't mind, let me pick up on something you said. It was sort of a throwaway line, probably for you, but not for me, and that was the Star Trek reference. You know, one of the things that on Star Trek, there's not much religion. You know, they do have in the movies where they try to get beyond. I forgot the name of the place, but the religion ideas in Star Trek, especially in the first couple of series, they're very, in a sense, primitive. I mean, Worf was raised by his adoptive parents are Jewish, and when they come to visit him on the Enterprise, they're not just Jewish; they're Jewish from the old country, even though we're talking centuries earlier. They still look like they're from this shtetl in Europe. They sound like their Yiddish is their natural language. So and then his other religious beliefs are also in the Klingon world are also fairly primitive. You'd think that we would have evolved beyond that, but the real revolution in Star Trek that puts an end to war, at least within the Federation, is the replicator. If we had replicators, and you could simply take the carbon atom and turn it into whatever you wanted, Whether it's, a cup of Earl Grey hot or, something else. If you could do that, then what's the point of fighting? There's no scarcity anymore. If all you need for water is to say to your replicator, cup of cold water, and it shows up, then everything is changed. Now it's fiction, it's fantasy, but the idea is in that world, scarcity is the problem. And in our world, it's not really that different. I mean, scarcity is the problem. If we could figure out a way to do away with scarcity without, as you just said, having us all live, as if we were, Bedouin in the Sinai. Is there a way to pull that off? I mean, that would be an interesting thing. The other thing and two quick things. The other thing that's missing in Star Trek is there's no humor. They don't have comedians. They don't go on a cruise ship. There's always a comedian. You think there'd be at least a holographic program of some 24th century comedians. There's no comedians. That must say something about their society.
There's one episode where Data goes to the holodeck to learn humor, and he summons this Jerry Lewis-like character to teach him jokes, and he learns all these 50s shtick bits and slapstick humor.
Yeah, right, exactly. So they have had comedy of their own for centuries. I mean, it's funny because we can relate to that, some of us. But there's something happened to them that they lost their comedic edge or something. I mean, I'm making this up. Who knows? The other thing, though, that I think is important, we should at least mention before we run out of time, is the return of the archetypal mother, the divine feminine. That Carl Jung said this was the major religious or spiritual revolution of the 20th century, and I think it's still going on. Bede Griffith said something similar, that the return of the mother archetype, the fact that Mary was elevated, I think in the 50s, to, the notion in Catholicism was made official that she was raised bodily into heaven, where she sits, by the side of God and Jesus. And in every religious tradition, I think the Divine Mother is making this humongous, powerful comeback. And it's not this loving, I'll take care of everybody kind of mother. It's not that at all. It's a very fierce, powerful, feminine archetype that is challenging the nonsense that passes for religion in our own time. And I think this is something we have to really begin to appreciate. I personally, I've written a couple of books about this. I am very engaged with the divine feminine spiritual side of things. And her return in Judaism, Christianity, she never really left, but in Protestantism anyway, Catholicism, Mary is still there, was always strong. But in Judaism, Christianity, even in Islam, she's making a comeback, though that's probably the most difficult one to do. But in Taoism, the Tao Te Ching, talks about the mysterious female and cling to the feminine, even as you use the masculine. All these religious traditions have the Divine Mother in one form or another, but she is making a huge comeback. Yin and yang, it has to go together. One of the problems that the patriarchal religions went through, they got rid of the matriarchy, and then they got rid of the mother with a capital M. They got rid of the Divine Mother. I mean, the Hebrew God had a consort, Shekhinah. The way the universe was created, according to Proverbs chapter 8, is through a woman, the divine wisdom. And these religious traditions always, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are all masculine. It makes no sense, right? Originally, it must have been, Father, Mother, and Son, or Father, Mother, and Daughter.
I've read some that in early Christianity, the Holy Spirit is the feminine. Sophia, wisdom.
Yeah, I think that's true, that also happens. And then in the medieval Christian mysticism of Yaakov Burma, for example, he never talks about Christ, but rather talks about Christos Sophia. He blends the two in this marriage of the masculine and the feminine, if you're really going to have a redemptive wisdom. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about the return of the Divine Mother. It's not at the expense of the masculine archetype. It's a rebalancing, but it has to come from, in order to rebalance, I mean, you have to let the pendulum swing to a point where the mother is re-empowered if she ever lost power. I was very lucky, and I'll stop talking about that in a second. But in 1970, or 1969, when I started college, I stumbled across this amazing guru who was a Quaker, retired religion professor from Smith College, Terry Havens. And she took me under her wing and taught me, we studied privately, she was retired, we studied privately the Bhagavad Gita, what to eat in the woods. We would meet outside when the weather permitted, and she would show me stuff you could eat if I was ever lost in the woods. The chances of me being lost in the woods being nil, because I like nature on the other side of an air-conditioned window. And she taught me about, she did this whole year comparing Shekhinah, the feminine in Judaism, with Shakti, the feminine in Hinduism. And it was just fascinating to learn stuff that I had never been taught before, never been allowed to notice before, even though it's right there in the text.
The last thing I wanted to ask you about before we finish up is the difference between different media. You write a column, you write books, you host podcasts. What do you think is the most effective mode of communication for the future?
Oh boy, predict for the future. Oh, okay. We'll have to put that one aside. I don't know if I have any predictions, but I have opinions. Opinions.
For you, what do you?
Okay. So for me, I've written over 36 books, and I'm done with books. Now, I say that now, maybe I'll change my mind, but I think that long form books are just not speaking to people the way they used to. And everything I've had to say, I've already said it. And so I've got, a few books that are coming out over the next couple of years, and that'll be the end of it. I think that short form writing is still very powerful. Parables, aphorisms, that kind of thing. I think that podcasts are very, very powerful because they're so immediate. I mean, even the magazine, and I work for Spirituality and Health magazine. I think it's a fine magazine. I love my column. I've been doing it for 10 years. It only comes out every other month, so it's only a 6-time-a-year magazine. It can't respond in print to things that are happening in the moment. I mean, it does better on the website. But stuff like you're doing, or my own podcast, Essential Conversations with Rabbi Rami, or so many other people's podcasts, can just dive into the moment and bring out all kinds of wisdom that is incredibly timely, even if it's also incredibly transient. So I think podcasts have definitely a bright future. I think that, I'd like to think that magazines do also, but I'm putting my future focus on podcasts. Now, having said that, I think that face-to-face conversation is still the best. So I go on the road as often as possible. I have my own wisdom school that meets 3 times a year here in Tennessee. I like sitting across from people and chanting together in the same room, having serious contemplative conversations with people face to face. I think we shouldn't ever lose that. I mean, I even have a program that I developed with my friend Frank Levy through our foundation, the One River Foundation, called Cup of Wisdom, where we send you free copies of the World Wisdom Bible that I wrote, an anthology of perennial wisdom teachings, but copies of the World Wisdom Bible, coffee mugs with the Cup of Wisdom logo on it, and you get a box of 12 of each, and we help you start your own little salon in your house or coffee shop or anywhere else you want to do it. But most of them are done in people's homes where, once a week or once every couple of weeks, people come over, you have coffee, and you read from these sacred texts from different religions and talk about how they speak to you. The conversation that occurs between, it doesn't always have to be friends, it could be strangers. The way we have it set up is you invite 5 friends, people you know, and you ask them to invite one person you don't know. so that you end up with 11 or 12 people, half of whom are new to one another. So, or new to you anyway. So in that kind of context, the power of seeing the other's face, the power of hearing another's voice in the context of an embodied voice, actually being there with them, I think cannot be underestimated. So I ultimately what I love is that kind of face-to-face conversation and contemplative practice, even if you're silent, but being silent with others. I think that's the most powerful, but that's the most difficult. So, especially if you're talking about someone like myself who's trying to reach large numbers of people for whatever egoistic reason I'm doing that, podcasts work better.
What was the name of that project again? Where can listeners sign up?
Oh, so thank you. It's One River Foundation. .org, and the project is called Cup of Wisdom. And you just let, through the website, you let Frank know you'd like to try to do this with some friends, and he'll send you the stuff.
So great. You have that. You have your trip to Israel this coming October, and your book, Holy Rascals, just came out.
Yeah, just about a month ago. Seems to be doing well. It's supposed to be funny as well as informative. And so it does go pretty quickly. Where can people get it, Spencer? Is that what you're going to ask?
Where can people find your book?
So, first I always say go to a local bookstore if you have one, your independent bookstore first, and you can order it if they don't have a copy. Barnes & Nobles carries it. Amazon certainly carries it. Any of those, or the publisher, Sounds True, would be, I'm sure, happy to send copies.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Are there any other projects you'd like to mention before we go?
No, that's great. It was a great conversation. I appreciate you having me on the show.
I've never said this before to a guest, but we're getting towards enough episodes now where I feel like we could probably revisit some things at some point, and I would love to have another conversation with you because we really have struggled to keep it an hour or less just to make it listenable, and I just feel like there's so much more we could be talking about. I'd love to have you back on again.
I would love to come back on. You guys are fun to talk with.
Well, thanks so much, and we'll talk to you soon, and have a great day.
You too. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Conscious Community Podcast. If you'd like more information about sponsoring the show, please email Spencer at SPENCER at ConsciousCommunityMagazine.com. That's Spencer at ConsciousCommunityMagazine.com, or call 630-492-0831, 630-492-0831.